Hello and welcome to Mr. C History. Now, last week I made a video about the Whitechapel murders of Jack the Ripper, and in that video I didn't make much mention of his victims, the 5 women who were murdered. And that's because this week I want to tell their story. This is a story that's often been forgotten, or dare I say dismissed. The story of the canonical 5. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Katherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly. I want to learn a bit about their early life and what brought them to Whitechapel and the lead up to their tragic deaths. Now, the first victim of Jack the Ripper was Polly Nichols, or to give her her birth name, Mary Ann Walker, and she was born here on Shoe Lane, right in the heart of the city of London, just by Fleet Street. Now, it looked very, very different at the time in 1848. This would have been a warren of sort of various shops and tightly packed houses, etc. Her father was a blacksmith, her husband ran a laundry, and they probably ran it out of the same shop. It's that sort of environment. And aged 18, she married a man called William Nichols, and they married in St Bride's Church, that little steeple there, the one that's shaped like a wedding cake called St Bride's, and they go on to have 5 children. So a pretty normal life for a working class woman in Victorian Britain. Only other thing to say is, why is she known as Polly? Well, Polly is actually just a nickname for Mary, but much more common in the 19th century, a bit like Peggy and Margaret, for example. But anyway, I say a normal life for Polly at this point, but things are going to get worse. By the 1870s, however, things were not going well for Polly. Her marriage to William was breaking down. She said it was because he had an affair. He says it was because of her alcoholism. But whatever the case, by 1881 she finds herself here at Lambeth Workhouse, of which this tower is all that remains. On the records she's listed as a charwoman, a tea lady, and actually she's sort of in and out of this place, scrapping money wherever she can. And she also, unfortunately, has quite a few records of criminal activity. She's arrested a few times. She's arrested for sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square, she is arrested for drunk and disorderly, and she is arrested for prostitution. She alienates her family and her ex-husband, who stop paying her, and by 1888 things are very desperate for Polly. This is a very good example of a theme that runs through all of Jack the Ripper's victims, of how dependent Victorian women were on their husbands, how easy their lives could descend into poverty and alcoholism and prostitution if their husband was not there to provide for them. There simply were no opportunities for Victorian working class women. This is Flower and Dean Street, and I'll actually be coming back here quite a few times because 3 of Jack the Ripper's victims actually lived in this area. Now, it's slightly wrong to call this really a street. It was sort of a warren of various different slums, very cramped housing, poor condition housing, lots of deprivation and disease. Now, what about Polly? Well, in April of 1888, she'd actually got a job as a domestic servant. And I think things were going well, but very quickly it turns bad because 3 months later she is living here, having been sacked because of stealing clothes. Now, by the night of the 31st of August 1888, she's living at 56 Flower and Dean Street. And that night she's seen drinking at the Frying Pan Inn on Brick Lane. And she'd come back here, but her landlord had said, no, you haven't paid your rent, 4p. So she says to the landlord, don't worry, I'll go out and earn it. She grabbed her new black bonnet, put it on, and went off out into the night. And what's interesting about this is she's murdered about 2 or 3 hours later, about 1.5 miles away from here, Bucks Row, near what is now Whitechapel Station. And there are various accounts of her being quite drunk and talking to various different men. On the ground here at the City of London Cemetery is a plaque to Polly Nichols, or as she was more formally known, Mary Ann Nichols. She was given quite a big funeral actually in the end, quite a grand hearse, etc. Her father was there, her estranged husband and 3 of her children, and apparently thousands of people lined the route. She was buried in an unmarked grave, and sadly, because there's been quite a bit of redevelopment of the cemetery, it's been lost, but the plaque is here now. Now, she obviously was the first murder, so the press uproar wasn't quite there yet, and people were linking it to the earlier Whitechapel murders. But I think hers is quite a sad tale, really. It's she was a mother of 5, and she was trying to work her best and got sent into the workhouses and things like that, but just got pushed and pushed into poverty and destitution. A very, very sad tale. Now, the second victim of Jack the Ripper was Annie Chapman, who was born Eliza Ann Smith here in Paddington. But she actually had quite an itinerant childhood, moving all over the place, because she was the eldest daughter of a soldier, George Smith. And actually this was a good time to be the child of a soldier, the 1840s, because there wasn't much war going on. The Crimean War hadn't started, a few colonial skirmishes, but that was that. Despite this though, and according to her brother, from an early age Annie had taken to drink, to alcohol, a common theme that's going to unfortunately run through her life. She does manage to sort herself out by the age of 29, and she actually marries a man called John Chapman, and has 3 children with him. And actually he has quite a respectable job as a coachman, driving the horse and the coach for well-to-do gentlemen, including people in Mayfair, etc. And actually eventually he gets a very good job as a coachman for a manor house out in Windsor. By 1881, things are looking up for Annie. She moves here to St Leonard's Hill estate outside Windsor in Berkshire. That's because her husband John has just got a job as a coachman for the man who owned this estate. At the time, this was a stately home. Now it is rather posh houses. Now this was quite a prestigious and good job. It was decent wage, good uniform, and crucially it came with accommodation and nice grand area, good clean air away from the streets of London for Annie. Annie herself would have also had jobs, domestic things to do as well, so things are looking good. But very quickly things turn very sour and unfortunately very tragic. Just 1 year after moving here, their daughter Emily Ruth dies of meningitis aged 12. Now this has a profound impact, and something which unfortunately has dominated Annie's life comes creeping back, and that is alcohol and alcoholism. Her father had been a drunk, and she had tried to sign the temperance pledge with her sister many times, but many times she had fallen back into alcoholism. And indeed their younger son John, who was born with lots of physical defects, it is believed by many that many of those physical defects were caused by fetal alcohol dependency syndrome. Essentially Annie had been drinking far too heavily whilst pregnant with him. And with the death of Emily, it led to a downward spiral of drink. And there were a few occasions where Annie was arrested in Windsor and in Clewer for drunk and disorderly. Now obviously this becomes very embarrassing for John and for his employer, who was a man called Francis Tress Barry, who was going to go on to become a baron and an MP, but at this time he was a copper merchant making money from Portugal, still quite a respectable person. He didn't want to be associated with a woman being arrested for drunk and disorderly, and so unfortunately John and Annie separate. Annie has to leave the safe confines of Windsor. After leaving Windsor, Annie made her way here to Whitechapel, specifically to Dorset Street, which has totally been rebuilt over now, one of the most notorious and infamous deprived streets of Whitechapel. Of course, that's where also Mary Jane Kelly, the Jack the Ripper's 5th and final victim, was found. They probably knew each other. Now, at first, Annie was living off an allowance given to her by John, her husband, but actually soon his life also hit the skids and that allowance dried up. And so by the summer of 1888, Annie is in a desperate situation. She's extremely ill. She was only 47 years old, but witnesses say she looked much, much older. And indeed, after her death, and the coroner inspected her body and found lots of scarring on her lungs, essentially TB, and they suggested that she actually probably only had a few months to live. But what is she doing in the summer of 1888? Well, she's doing a bit of crocheting, she's selling flowers, a meagre existence, and of course, as I say, being very ill and very depressed, and of course turning to drink. And the night she is murdered, the 8th of September 1888, she cannot afford the money to pay for her lodgings and is kicked out. They do give her a baked potato though, and she was seen going off in that direction towards Spitalfields Market and of course to Hanbury Street, where at 5:30 in the morning a witness sees Annie talking to a man of the age of about 40 who looked a bit shabby apparently, and the witness heard the man saying, "Will you?" and Annie saying yes, probably a negotiation for prostitution. Half an hour later, her body is discovered in the yard at Hanbury Street. This is Manor Park Cemetery, and this is where Annie Chapman was buried, originally in an unmarked grave somewhere around here, and in recent years they've given her this rather grand gravestone. Now her funeral was actually in relative secret because by now the press was getting into a frenzy. It was her murder and the leather apron and all these sort of things that was starting to raise the temperature up, so they kept it all quiet. But I think her tale is a very sad one. She had almost given up on life really by the end, and there is a common theme that runs through all of the canonical five that really impacted her, and that is the demon drink, the alcohol. Alcohol is clearly something that ran through the lives of these women perniciously and drove them to despair and to ruin. In Annie Chapman, it drove her to Whitechapel and into the arms of the killer. Now the third victim of Jack the Ripper, of course, was Elizabeth Stride, and she was born in 1843 with the name Elizabeth Gustavsdotter in an area called Torslanda in Sweden. She was Swedish, which is why I've come here to the Swedenborg Gardens in Shadwell. We're just a few streets over from Whitechapel, indeed very close to Enrique Street, where she is brutally murdered. Now, with the Industrial Revolution, Britain needed more and more timber to build the railways, bridges, etc. And a lot of that timber came from Sweden, which meant that there were lots of Swedish immigrants, a big Swedish community here in London. And this, apparently, in the 1880s, was the heart of the Swedish community. So it would be staggering if Elizabeth didn't come here quite regularly. So as I say, she was born in 1843 on a farm, and she worked on the farm for most of her childhood, and her parents were good Lutheran stock. She was actually pretty well educated, and she had quite a happy upbringing. In 1860, however, she moves to the city of Gothenburg. Sweden has started to industrialise and urbanize, and the pull of the big city came. But something clearly happens between 1860 and 1865, because in 1865 she appears with a criminal record. The police have her on a list of criminals, specifically as people who are soliciting prostitution. Indeed, she's also recorded as living in a reform institution. Something has gone wrong with Elizabeth's life. And 1865 is the year that she decides to leave Sweden and come here to London. Now, why? Well, there's lots of speculation. We ultimately don't know. There's speculation that maybe she had a child, maybe there had been some sort of sexual attack upon her, maybe she had fallen in with the wrong group, or maybe alcoholism had taken her over. But whatever the case, she finds herself moving here to England, and initially she gets a good job as a domestic servant. In 1869, Elizabeth married John Stride, who was a ship's carpenter based in the docks, and actually they gathered enough money together to open up a coffee shop here on Poplar High Street, which in the 1870s was quite up and coming, quite sort of desirable place, certainly better than the Whitechapel area where she will end up. Now things initially go well, but something clearly bad happens, because by 1877 they are both in the Poplar workhouse and the coffee shop has gone. It's difficult to pinpoint what's going on, financial troubles, but one other clue might be that police records show that in her time here in London, Elizabeth Stride was arrested 8 times for drunken disorderly, which I think this is going to put a strain on any marriage, and indeed on her. And their relationship is difficult, and it gets worse in 1884, where John dies of tuberculosis, pushing Elizabeth really even further down. Now, sadly, by 1884, John dies of tuberculosis, pushing Elizabeth even further down, and she ends up here at 32 Flower and Dean Street. and by this time she goes by the nickname Long Liz. I think this is because she was 5'5", which in Victorian London, especially in the Whitechapel area, that was considered very tall for a lady. She is scraping by on existence, domestic work and things like that. And on the 29th of September, just before she is murdered, she goes for a drink on Commercial Street. And various witness statements say about 1 in the morning she's on Berners Street talking to various different men. One witness says she hears her say, "No, not tonight," perhaps suggesting that there was some negotiation for prostitution. And then her body is discovered at 1 a.m. This is the grave of Elizabeth Stride at East London Cemetery near West Ham. Now, some ripperologists don't actually include Elizabeth Stride in the list of Jack the Ripper's victims because she was not mutilated like the rest, but I think most do put her in the canonical 5 because she fits that profile, a woman in her 40s alone and with that signature deep cut to the throat. Her funeral was 1 week later on the 6th of October and not attended by many people. Now, hers is a very sad tale. It's the tale of an immigrant woman here to London, who tried to ingratiate herself in London. She got married, she set up a business, she learnt English. Apparently, she even tried to learn Yiddish, the lingua franca of the East End at the time. But sadly, she was walking down the wrong street at the wrong time. I think her grave now is being looked after and it's been recently done up, so at least that there is some attempt at memorial now. Now, so far I've been very reluctant to use the P word, prostitution and prostitute. It is true that some of Jack the Ripper's victims did sell their bodies for sex, but that is not the whole story. These were women who were on the edge of society, on the edge of survival. They had to do anything to earn the few pennies to pay for their lodging, pay for their food. So sometimes that meant picking fruit out in Kent or working as a seamstress in a factory or making flowers or something like that. And of course it also meant selling your body for sex occasionally. This was the life of poor Victorian women. And the problem we have is the police and very definitely the press, they just held on to one thing, the prostitute angle, and they used this to define these women. Indeed, they often were referred to as just prostitutes, victim blaming, almost justifying the brutal actions of Jack the Ripper, as if he was cleansing society of something. And to my mind, this is wrong. These women should not be defined by that one particular aspect of their life. They had many other facets to them, which is why I am reluctant to use that term too much. Now, the fourth victim of Jack the Ripper was Katherine Eddowes, and she actually wasn't born in London. She was born in Wolverhampton in 1842. She was the sixth of 12 children. Her father made tin plates for sort of steam engines and things like that, and her mother was a cook. Aged 1, Katherine Eddowes and her family moved down to London, to Bermondsey. And interestingly, they made the journey down from Wolverhampton on the canals, trying to get work as they went along. But sadly, aged 12, Katherine Eddowes' mother died, and aged 15, her father died. She was orphaned, and it actually meant that she had to move into the Bermondsey workhouse, which was located right where I am standing now. Eventually, family back in Wolverhampton managed to get work for her, and she moved back to the West Midlands, the Black Country, to Wolverhampton, and she worked in the tin factories there. She also met her husband, Thomas Conway, and indeed actually on her body, on her forearm here, was tattooed TC. But things go off the rails, sadly. She loses her job, the suggestion being that there was a theft involved, and her and Thomas Conway move back here to London, where they descend into alcoholism and vagary. They do have 3 children, and nominally he did have work actually as a soldier, but by 1880, sadly, the marriage had broken down. Now, by 1884, Katherine was living in, you guessed it, Flower and Dean Street, number 55, literally the next door to where Polly Nichols was living. And she was supporting herself through domestic work, making a few sort of embroidery things, and hop picking, which is indeed what she was doing in the September of 1888. She had been in the fields of Kent picking hops and fruit as the harvest came. Now, on the 29th of September, the night she was killed, she'd actually just been arrested. She'd been arrested on Aldgate High Street for drunkenness, and she was taken to Bishopsgate Police Station, which is still there, albeit with a different building. Now, she was released at 1 a.m. and 44 minutes later, her body is discovered half a mile away with her kidney missing in Mitre Square. Quite a quick turnaround. This is the memorial plaque for Katherine Eddowes, just down from Polly Nichols over there at the City of London Cemetery. And apparently she had quite a large funeral. 500 people lined the route of her hearse. I suppose this was the fourth murder, so there was a lot of press and local interest. But her sister was there. She did have a child. Her estranged husband was there. So there was a family really to grieve. And her murder was the very interesting one. It was one where the killer grew cocky and grew more frenzied, and he left clues and bits of evidence which I think nowadays would have got him caught. After this, the letter was sent, including that one with the human kidney, which really made the frenzy and took this myth and legend of Jack the Ripper to the stratosphere. Now, the fifth and final victim of Jack the Ripper, of course, was Mary Jane Kelly, and she's the victim whose life is least known about at all. There isn't even actually a picture of her. All the other four, they have pictures. Mary Jane Kelly does not. There's drawings of her, but no pictures. And her early life is shrouded in mystery. It's also shrouded with a bit of embellishment. I think Mary Jane Kelly told lots of people lots of different stories. What people believe is that she was born in 1863, because of course she was Jack the Ripper's youngest victim, and she was born in Ireland, in Limerick in Ireland. And then as a child, her family moved to South Wales. Her father worked in the ironworks, they're the newly formed ironworks, and was doing pretty well. She even apparently got married at age 16, but things went off the rails when her new husband died in a mining accident, and she first moved to Cardiff and then had to move here to London, presumably to find work or whatever. And indeed she did. She found work as a domestic servant actually in Chelsea. And all in all, things were going well until 1884, when she's living here in Crispin Street in Whitechapel, which is right near the notorious Dorset Street slums where she is eventually killed. And apparently she has lots of expensive dresses with her, and there is a suggestion that she'd stolen these from the house she was the domestic servant in Chelsea. This is the famous 10 Bells pub just outside Spitalfields Market, and I would suggest that all the people in our story, the 5 victims and Jack the Ripper himself, would have gone through this pub at this time. And indeed Mary Jane Kelly was a regular customer. I mentioned before there's some suggestion of embellishment of her early life. Well, it was because she was telling various people the story in this pub, and indeed she visited this pub the night that she was murdered on the 8th of November. Now, by 1888, Mary Jane Kelly actually was living with a man, Joseph Bartlett, and things were going relatively all right. He had a job as a fish porter, but at the end of October, he had lost his job. Things were quite desperate, and Mary Jane Kelly had to resort to prostitution. Now, the 10 Bells was infamous as a place where men would go to pick up prostitutes. And indeed, in the night, the 8th of November, that is what Mary Jane Kelly was doing. She lived just over there in Dorset Street. There was another pub there as well called the Horn of Plenty, which she was also at on the night she was killed. And there are various different witness statements as to lots of different men in and around 13 Miller's Court where she was murdered. There was a story of a stout, ginger-haired man, a very well-dressed man in a bowler hat. It's not very well known which is which. I think Miller's Court, when Dorset Street itself was notorious as a hangout for many, many prostitutes. But what's interesting, it was a very busy street, and throughout the night people would be walking along it and nobody heard the cries as Mary was brutally mutilated. And it's not until 10:45 a.m. the morning afterwards that the horrible discovery is made. This is St Patrick Roman Catholic Cemetery in Leyton, and this is the grave of Mary Jane Kelly, the last of Jack the Ripper's victim. Now, she had both the smallest and the largest funeral. There are actually only 8 people here for the burial, but as her hearse went through London, apparently several thousand EastEnders lined the route. By now, of course, the story of Jack the Ripper had gripped London. She's the very mysterious member of the canonical 5. I mean, even there's debate about her actual name. Her gravestone here says Marie Jeanette Kelly. That's because apparently she spent some time in France and she called herself that occasionally. But she was known as Dark Mary, sometimes known as Emma. And this mystery and obscurity shrouds her life. There are even some ripperologists who suggest maybe actually there might be a case of mistaken identity here, and that this isn't the Mary Kelly that people thought it was. This was just another woman in the same boarding house, and all confusing. But actually this speaks to something very interesting about working class women in London. They were invisible. There were no records kept about them. They went about and nobody knew who they were. And actually we probably know more about Mary Jane Kelly than we do the vast majority of other women in London. And she's an interesting symbol of the obscurity and the invisibility of women at the time. So there you are, the story of the 5 victims of Jack the Ripper. And this has been an interesting tale about the precarious nature of life for working class women in Victorian London. It was a brutal, horrible existence, always on the edge of survival. And there would have been hundreds of thousands of women like these 5 women. It's only because of their gruesome deaths that we know their story.